morning and welcome to today's session where I introduce to you the Ugandan epic poem Song of Lawino by the Ugandan poet Okot Bitek. Okot Bitek was an Ugandan poet. He lived from 1931 till 1982. After his poetry, after his style of writing, even an Okot school of poetry or the East African song school emerged. It was also known as comic singing. They focused on dramatic verse monologue, as you can see when you take a look at this poem. Bitek used to borrow many features from traditional songs, and he attempted to bring African forms, native African forms and traditions into his writings, and his highlight was on not using European traditions, to move away from the European traditions, which he thought had begun to dominate most of the traditional forms which were prevalent in Africa. The major works of Bitek include The Lost Spear, a poem that was the first work that he had got published. He also wrote one long novel, Laktar, that was in 1953, and he worked on many issues related to social anthropology. And one of his important critiques of social anthropology in the context of Africa is African religions and Western scholarship. His thesis, which he completed in 1964, was titled Oral Literature and its Background Among the Lakoli and Lango. And in 1971, he published a collection titled Two Songs. In 1975, he brought out a collection of essays titled Africa's Cultural Revolution. In 1974, he brought out another collection of Ekoli songs, The Horn of My Love. And in 1978, he also published this set of tales, which was a refreshing take on some of the familiar African tales. It was titled Hare and Hornbill. And these widely different books, as you can see, they're from different genres. They focus on different aspects of African life. And these widely different books are, however, united by Okot's concern that the nations of Africa should be built on African and not on European foundation. So this is a very anti-colonial and a different kind of post-colonial rhetoric altogether. Song of Lawino, the epic poem that we try to take a look at today. This was published in 1966. The title in Ekoli language was Verpa Lawino, and Ekoli language, especially in the Lua province, that's a tonal language, and it's considered that Song of Lawino is one of the most widely read works from sub-Saharan Africa. This is narrated from the point of view of the woman who's named Lawino, and it's a first-person narrator. This epic poem, that's how it's structured. It was written during Okot's involvement with the Gulu festival. Gulu was the place where he was born, and he was engaged actively in many of the traditional forms and the many festivals which used to showcase the traditional art forms and the traditional ways of being. Okot was strongly influenced by the traditional songs in terms of composition, the techniques, the themes. So we find him almost replicating the entire tradition in this process of bringing out Lawino. It's said that just like the African traditional way of composing songs go by, he also used to run his material, run his poem through his friends, and across his friends he used to accept the critiques and the suggestions given by them. And this Song of Lawino, this epic poem, has undergone a number of revisions in that sense. So the process of writing, the process of composition itself has a traditional underlying rationale to it. The poem Song of Lawino, it's based on a real social problem in rural areas, especially in East Africa. And it's about the educated African man's contempt for the ways of their parents and their wives. And it also addresses the conflict of cultures. It's narrated from the point of view of Lawino, who is a woman and also the wife of another character, Okol. And we find her, Lawino, emerging as not just an isolated case, but almost like a spokesperson for Africa itself. This could be loosely described as an African woman's lament. And she's lamenting this fact that her husband has been abandoning the local traditions, the native African traditions, in favor of the Western traditions. There was a response to a Song of Lawino, which Okot himself had composed. This came out in 1970, and this is in the form of Okol, Lawino's husband, responding to the charges leveled against him. And unlike Song of Lawino, Song of Okol was written in English. There was no Ekoli version. Due to the immense success and popularity of both of these works, Song of Lawino and Song of Okol, And in some of the editions, you can find both these epic poems being united in one single book, Song of Lawino and Song of Okot together. And Okot and Lawino have become common nouns, almost like have become common nouns in the many references to Africa. And they have also become two characters who are now seen as prototypes of two opposing cultures and two opposing approaches to the cultural future of Africa. The character of Lawino is what the Song of Lawino mostly focuses on. We find the character undergoing a transformation throughout these different segments and different chapters of this poem, and through her own character, through her own articulations, we also get to follow her line of argument and how she presents this problem, which is rather imminent and immediate in the context of Africa. In the first 5 chapters, we get an almost perfect portrait of a woman scorned. She is lashing out at Okot and the woman that right now Okot is favoring, Clementine. She is a westernized woman. After these first 5 chapters, we do not find any reference to Tina or Clementine, the other woman. And from chapters 6 to 11, Lawino is less concerned with her own personal plight. On the other hand, she defends the customs of her ancestors. She attempts comparisons between Western and Ekoli ways. It goes to address more social issues than her own personal concerns. The last 2 chapters, 12 and 13, they try to tie both these concerns together, the personal aspect as well as the social aspect. And on the whole, what gets highlighted here is Lawino's desire to win back Okot's admiration, her husband's admiration, and it also offers a commentary on the whole of Ekoli community. There's an appeal for the renewal of traditional ways. One here also needs to keep in mind that Lawino seems to be okay with the polygamic practices, and that is seen as something which is traditionally built into the most of the African communities. So her problem with the other woman, Clementine, is not necessarily the polygamous relationship, but it's mostly focused on the westernized ways that Clementine represents and how Okot, her husband, prefers to choose the westernized ways over the traditional ways. Clementine is Okot's new westernized educated wife, and she is presented in stark contrast with that of Lawino. And one may have different opinions about the approach that Lawino has towards Clementine, about the different ways in the gender operates over here. We shall not be going into too many details of this. I will perhaps just introduce this point to you, introduce this entire body of writing to you for you to read, analyze and make your own judgment. The imagery in Song of Lawino is something that we shall briefly focus in today's lecture. We find that in Song of Lawino as well as in Song of Okot later on, we find Okot Bitek completely avoiding the stock of common images of English literature. So when we are reading the English version, we get a feeling of freshness, and it's said that it gives a feeling of freshness for every reader and a sense of Africanness for African readers. So that's how the imagery, the translated imagery rather, is placed. And Okot also had succeeded in using English as a tool to reach a wider audience, and this he manages to do by staying away from the non-European traditions and images, and also by not borrowing foreign elements that would perhaps distort his message. So he sticks to traditional elements as far as possible, but at the same time, the form of this work, this epic poem, it needs some kind of an appropriation as well, because Okot is forced to take the ideas of individual authorship, of spoken verse, of rhyme, of division into chapters, of the printed word. These are the things that he borrows from the Western tradition, because in Ekoli language, in Ekoli song tradition, there's no idea of a long poem authored by a single person. Ekoli songs, though this work, Song of Lawino, is written in the traditional African song culture, the Ekoli songs themselves, they are just about 1 or 2 verses with musical accompaniment. There's no culture of writing, no tradition of producing a long poem or a long song. And the Ekoli songs are also not written down under one person's authorship. They're part of oral tradition. They continue to adapt themselves in various ways, and it's sung and adapted by singer after singer, and each singer is free to create in his own way or even change the song according to the setting, according to the context. So there is no single authorship which is attributed to the Ekoli songs. We find Bitek, for obvious reasons, moving away from this tradition, appropriating the Western ideas of authorship, of rhyme, of long poems, of rhyme, etc. Because in Ekoli songs, there's no rhyme scheme, there's no regular rhythm either. And Song of Lawino in that sense cannot be seen as a written version of an Ekoli song. On the other hand, Okot Bitek has aspired to do something bigger than that, not just a translation, but an adaptation of a tradition to new conditions of performance, and rather coming up with a new form itself. That's what Song of Lawino does in terms of looking at it in the context of world literature. There are certain instances which would also tell us about some difficulties in translation and even certain kinds of impossibility of translation. There's a refrain which keeps getting repeated in this poem. It is loosely translated as, "The pumpkin in the old homestead must not be uprooted." This is an adaptation of a proverb in Ekoli, but when this is translated into English, some commentators argue that the original meaning is entirely lost. The original context is entirely lost. One of the commentators who has also written an introduction to Song of Lawino and Song of Okot, G.A. Heron, he points this out, and this is how he tries to address the problem and try and interpret this poem for the non-African, non-Ekoli speaking audience. Pumpkins are a luxury food. They grow wild throughout Ekoli land. To uproot pumpkins, even when you are moving to a new homestead, is simple wanton destruction. In this proverb, then, Lawino is not asking Okot to cling to everything in his past, but rather not to destroy things for the sake of destroying them. Again, the refrain is used to emphasize an important idea the writer is putting across in the whole poem. Given that this is the refrain which appears almost throughout the poem, the pumpkin in the old homestead must not be uprooted, and the intention here is to directly engage with the African person, the African reader who is familiar with the proverb and who is familiar with the context within which the proverb gets used. And it also serves the dual purpose of trying to engage with the English reader, but by trying to make him or her familiar with the many contexts within which proverbs or usages are placed, and also inviting the non-African reader to participate in this exchange of traditions, in this dialogue across traditions. There are certain sections throughout this poem where the vivid imagery is visible. For instance, look at this excerpt, and this is a very non-European, a non-Western kind of description that Okot attempts to provide in Lawino's words. Mad creature, her hair a burnt-out forest, her eyes shooting out from the head, a pair of rockets, serpent tongues, spitting poison, lashing crocodile tail. If you look at the imagery, those are taken from the native traditions. There are allusions that one could find as well. And for the African reader, this is essentially very, very native and something more familiar. The pictures, the imagery is more familiar than it is perhaps to a Western audience. It also has a different kind of a rhythm, which is not really part of the Western or European poetical scheme. It's a very lively bouncing rhythm, keeping in tune with the African languages and also with the traditional forms of art and culture that they have. And in this excerpt, you sister from Okot, who grew in the open air, you're fresh, come, walk with me. So it is, the rhythm, there is a rhythm, but it is not in the conventional way. It's more like a bouncing, lively rhythm. Lawino comes across as someone who represents the African traditions, and she also comes across as someone who is not given to hypocritical ways of thinking. And she chooses this instance of the colonialists often talking about the dance culture in Africa and how they look down upon some of the dance forms, especially where there's a lot of nakedness involved. And she talks about how the colonialists gossip about the immorality of nakedness. And Lawino attempts a reasoned and balanced defense of dancing naked, which is an inherent part of some of the traditional African dance cultures. And this is how she talks about it. When the drums are throbbing and the black youths have raised much dust, you dance with vigor and health. You dance naughtily with pride. You dance with spirit. You compete, you insult, you provoke, you challenge all. And this is the kind of liberation that she attributes to that dance form which is seen as immoral, which is seen as something to be despised by the Westerners. And she also continues to attack the Western form of dance, which is seen as more sophisticated compared to the traditional dance culture, dance forms of Africa. And this is what she writes: each man has a woman, although she is not his wife. They dance inside the house and there's no light. Shamelessly they hold each other tightly, they cannot breathe. And it may seem as, this may come across as an aberration that Lawino's character is using the same kind of language to talk back against the colonial. She's also here trying to look down upon the forms of Western dance, but one can also say that perhaps she's using this kind of a language to talk back to the colonialists, to the Western audience who typically tries to look down upon the African traditions. And she is exposing, she's trying to expose the hypocrisy which is inherent over here by drawing her attention to the skewed ideas of morality that are prevalent mostly in the West. And she also very directly exposes the hypocrisy of the West, where she talks about how her own likes, the ones like Lawino, they are not the one who despise others, but it is the West who always try to look down upon the Africans and also their ways of being. And in the character of Clementine, she finds some kind of a personal provocation to begin talking about this entire tussle. In Lawino's words, I do not understand the ways of foreigners, but I do not despise their customs. And she goes on to say, no white woman wishes to do her hair like mine because she is proud of the hair with which she was born. She talks about how it is the West who always has this hierarchical way of understanding traditions and cultures, how it is always the West which looks down upon Africa as something to be despised, and it is never a move, this sort of a negative move is never made by the African woman. There are multiple ways in which one can read this, and there are many debates that we can engage with in this context. But as I mentioned, the intention of this lecture is mostly to introduce this poem to you and to show you that there are alternate traditions. There are multiple ways in which one can talk about literature even from non-European and non-Western vantage points. And this is Lawino's appeal to Okot and other Africans. As mentioned before, Lawino ceases to be just one woman who is gone. She ceases to be this wife of Okot who is upset that Okot is now going after Clementine, a westernized woman. And Lawino becomes a spokesperson who is appealing not just to Okot but to other African men and women as well. And this is how she articulates her appeal. Listen, Okot, my old friend, the ways of your ancestors are good. Their customs are solid and not hollow. They are not thin. They are not easily breakable. They cannot be blown away by the winds because their roots reach deep into the soil. This is a statement which perhaps Bitek also is trying to make to fellow Africans and also to his Western audience. This assumes more significance when we try to see how, from a personal appeal, Lawino is able to move towards a wider cultural appeal to address a wider socio-historical problem, and the possibility of placing this entire poem within the discourse of anti-colonial and post-colonial writings. Just like the Song of Lawino attempts to address the cultural death of Okot as well as other Africans who are westernized, the response, Song of Okot, it tries to justify the cultural apostasy. When we read these two works together, we also get a sense of the current forms of dialogue, especially from the mid-20th century onwards, the kinds of dialogues which have been going on between the African voices and the non-African voices, predominantly the Western European voices. And this poem is perhaps can be seen as one of those works which give an entry point to the ways in which world literature can be read as a body of writing where different traditions and different traditions which perhaps do not see eye to eye in terms of history, in terms of culture, in terms of forms of writing, how they can also sit together to enable the emergence of a new way of looking at literature, interpreting literature, and ultimately interpreting culture itself. I hope this introduction is interesting enough for you to go take a look at different non-European traditions and cultural forms which are available, and how the translations have also been made available to us to understand and appreciate and interpret and compare in today's context. I thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next session.